The Second World War bequeathed a legacy of numerous mysteries and enigmas, many of which remain unanswered to this day. One of the most contentious of these is the so-called Miracle of Dunkirk, a subject that has fueled historical debate for over 8 decades. Following Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, Great Britain and France, who had formed a military alliance with the Poles just days earlier, declared war on the Third Reich. However, any significant military action ceased almost immediately. This ushered in a period that has gone down in history as the Phony War. During this strange 8-month lull, the massive French and British armies remained almost entirely inert behind the Maginot Line, a period of eerie calm on the Western Front, while Poland was brutally crushed. Capitalizing on this complete inaction from the British and French, Hitler followed his conquest of Poland by occupying Denmark and Norway. This period of stasis finally shattered on May 10, 1940, when Germany initiated its plan for a lightning war against Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Early in 1940, a then relatively unknown staff officer, General Erich von Manstein, put forth an audacious and unexpected proposal. Correctly anticipating that the Allies would expect a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan from World War I and had therefore concentrated their finest forces in the north, near the Belgian border, Manstein proposed to exploit this assumption. His brilliant plan called for the main armoured thrust to be delivered further south, through the dense and supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. This region was so lightly defended precisely because the French High Command considered it a natural fortress, utterly unsuitable for a major tank offensive. The plan was to force a crossing of the Meuse River near Sedan, and then execute a rapid sickle-cut march to the English Channel coast, thereby completely cutting off the Northern Allied Army Group from its main lines of supply and communication. Although the German High Command initially deemed Manstein's plan exceedingly risky, it was personally approved by Hitler under the code name Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. This plan, in turn, was designed to pave the way for Fall Rot, Case Red, the subsequent swift invasion of France itself, bypassing the formidable fortifications of the Maginot Line. Meanwhile, the Allies were basing their entire strategy on the Deal-Breda plan. A critical feature and ultimate flaw of this plan was that its military architects were heavily influenced by political considerations. Instead of meeting the enemy on a prepared and fortified battlefield, vast formations of Allied troops were to execute a rapid manoeuvre into Belgium to establish defensive lines on unprepared territory and immediately engage the enemy in a meeting engagement. This proactive forward defence strategy was a massive gamble, abandoning the defensive advantages of their own fortified border for a highly mobile battle for which their command structure and communications were ill-prepared. The subsequent implementation of this plan would lead the Allied forces directly into a catastrophic trap. On the 10th of May, 1940, German forces launched their grand offensive. The Wehrmacht made a frontal assault on the Netherlands and Belgium, and the Allies, just as Manstein predicted, believed this to be the main attack. Initially, everything seemed to be unfolding according to the Allied plan. The Germans were advancing directly towards the lines where the Allies intended to defeat them. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and a powerful French army group immediately advanced towards Brussels. The main Allied forces were bracing for a decisive battle. However, while a decisive battle did indeed unfold, it was not where they expected. In the Ardennes, where no major offensive was anticipated, only second-rate French reserve divisions were positioned. Consequently, within the first few days, the Wehrmacht's armoured steamroller began its relentless push westward, sweeping away everything in its path. Desperate Allied counterattacks proved fruitless. By May 14th, the Netherlands had capitulated. Belgium held out longer, but its position quickly became hopeless. At this time, the British Expeditionary Force, numbering around 400,000 men, was stationed in France. Their mission was to assist their allies in the event of an enemy attack on the Western Front. However, the German offensive through the Ardennes and its shockingly rapid advance caught the Allies completely by surprise, and their only remaining option was to retreat. The commander of the BEF, Lord Gort, issued the order to begin a withdrawal to the west, but it was already too late. On May 20, 1940, German panzer divisions broke through to the coastal town of Abbeville, and a massive grouping of Allied troops found itself cut off and pinned against the sea. Trapped in this newly formed pocket, the Allied command desperately sought a way out of their dire situation. They launched a counterattack near the town of Arras, which struck the flank of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division and the SS Totenkopf, Death's Head Division. In some ways, it prefigured the later Soviet counterattacks of the summer of 1941. The Allies actually had superiority in the number and quality of their tanks, particularly the heavily armoured British Matilda II's. It was during the Battle of Arras that Rommel famously improvised by ordering his 88mm anti-aircraft guns to be used in an anti-tank role, a tactic for which they proved devastatingly effective due to their high velocity and flat trajectory. As a result, the battlefield was soon littered with dozens of burning Allied tanks, and the attackers began to fall back towards Dunkirk. The ring of encirclement was tightening with each passing hour. By the 23rd of May, the Germans had captured the key ports of Boulogne and Calais, leaving the Allies in control of only one last major port, Dunkirk, which was now a mere 20 kilometres away from the Wehrmacht's leading elements. The British command clearly understood that the objective was no longer to hold defensive lines, but to save what remained of their forces. The Belgian forces were rapidly collapsing, and any hope the British and French had of holding a line on the coast was all but gone. However, just as the German panzer divisions were poised for their final thrust on Dunkirk on May 23rd, Hitler issued his fateful halt order, stopping the advance. This was the first of the miracles of Dunkirk. The German units were instructed not to approach the city closer than 10 kilometres, and crucially, not to use tanks against the blockaded forces. Hitler's official reasoning was that the panzer divisions had become bogged down in fighting the encircled units in difficult terrain intersected by rivers and canals. He believed they needed to be conserved for the final push into the heart of France, Fall Rot. The decision was made to compress the Dunkirk pocket primarily with infantry and the Luftwaffe's air power. This order was met with utter bewilderment and frustration by the German generals on the front line. At the same time, the commander of the 19th Panzer Corps, Heinz Guderian, was known for his rather liberal interpretation of orders from above, if he believed they did not align with the operational situation. The very next day, in defiance of Hitler's order, his Corps' tanks and the Grossdeutschland regiment seized a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Aar Canal in the town of Saint-Georges, creating a direct threat to Dunkirk. The distance to the port was now less than 20 kilometres. Slightly to the south, the SS Leibstandarte regiment captured the town of Watten, situated on a hill from which the port facilities of Dunkirk were visible to the naked eye. Since the Allies could not ignore these actions, the very next day, on May 25, 1940, combat groups of the French 21st Infantry Division drove the Germans back to the western bank. The decisive factor was the total superiority. Ultimately, Hitler's order not only allowed the Germans to preserve their tank divisions, but also, in effect, saved the retreating British and French forces. Had the German tanks been unleashed, they could have literally ground the Allied armies into the sandy beaches of Dunkirk. Meanwhile, the evacuation of the encircled forces was becoming unavoidable. On May 25th, the command of the British Expeditionary Force ceased all attempts to launch counter-offensives and concentrated all efforts on defending the Dunkirk perimeter. The primary logistical challenge was the extreme difficulty of loading thousands of men onto large ships from open, unequipped beaches. The port itself, while damaged, offered the only possibility of embarking the maximum number of people quickly. The Allied position was deteriorating by the hour. However, for the time being, the encircled troops maintained their discipline, but the front was gradually losing its integrity. On May 28th, the Belgian army capitulated, exposing a massive gap in the defensive perimeter, and now only the remaining combat-effective British and French units were holding back the Germans. By this time, in London, preparations for a mass evacuation of the troops trapped against the sea were in full swing. The operation was given the code name Dynamo. Preparations had begun as early as May 20th, and on May 26th, the order for a general evacuation was finally given. Both Royal Navy warships and a vast flotilla of civilian vessels were utilised for the rescue. The government issued a call to arms for anyone with a seaworthy vessel to participate in the rescue effort. Soldiers were taken aboard not only from the Dunkirk harbour itself, but also from the adjacent beaches, where makeshift jetties were created by driving trucks into the water at low tide to allow smaller boats to dock. The Germans ferociously attacked the city and the port with artillery and aircraft, but they could not disrupt the evacuation. From air bases in southern England, the famous Spitfires and Hurricanes of the Royal Air Force flew out to engage the Germans. This was the first major test for the RAF's new fighters, and they performed admirably, often fighting at the very edge of their fuel range to protect the evacuation beaches. The power of the German Air Force proved to be significantly less decisive than anticipated. This is precisely why the piers of Dunkirk did not witness the same kind of horrific catastrophe that would unfold 2 years later during the siege of Sevastopol. On May 29th, another veritable miracle occurred. A massive armada of civilian vessels, ranging from simple fishing boats to... On this day, Churchill gave a special order that British ships were to embark French soldiers on an equal basis with the British. The 1st of June became one of the most difficult days of the evacuation. The Luftwaffe destroyed 31 British fighters and sank 31 ships, including 4 Allied destroyers. Nevertheless, on that same day, an incredible 64,000 soldiers were transported across the Channel to Albion. On the night of June 4th, German infantry finally advanced and closed in on Dunkirk. However, the vast majority of the encircled troops had already reached the shores of England. The French and British had stubbornly defended the perimeter around Dunkirk to the last possible moment. The Germans, by Hitler's initiative, had been deprived of the ability to use their main weapon, their panzer divisions. Guderian and Rommel could only watch with frustration and fury as their prey slipped from their grasp, but they could do nothing. The crucial moment had been lost. On the 4th of June, the evacuation ended. Over a period of 9 days, approximately 340,000 men were saved, including 224,000 British and 114,000 Allied soldiers, primarily French. Over 2,000 soldiers and sailors perished during the sea crossing. Around 50,000 French soldiers, who had heroically formed the rearguard covering the approaches to Dunkirk, were taken prisoner. At Dunkirk, the Allies were forced to abandon a staggering amount of equipment, fuel and ships sunk during German attacks. They left behind nearly 2,500 artillery pieces, 65,000 vehicles, 70,000 tons of ammunition, 150,000 tons of fuel, and 8,000 machine guns. In essence, all the heavy equipment and transport for 9 entire British divisions. But all of this material loss was incomparable to the salvation of the men. The British had managed to preserve the core of their trained, professional army, making the continuation of the war possible. Thus, a story of a catastrophic military defeat was transformed into a heroic tale of salvation, from which the Dunkirk myth immediately began to form, embellished with dramatic details. Certain circumstances of this pivotal episode of World War II remain subjects of debate. The most significant of these is why the panzer divisions were halted at the most decisive moment. Some historians lean towards the theory that Hitler was still hoping for a political settlement with Britain and did not want a bloodbath on the Channel to sever all possible ties between the two nations. In his speeches during the summer of 1940, Hitler openly stated that there were no reasons for the war between Germany and Great Britain to continue and called for negotiation. War with the Soviet Union was inevitable, and to prepare for it, Hitler wanted to eliminate the threat of a war on two fronts. Another prominent theory is that the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, boasted to Hitler that his air force alone could annihilate the cornered Allied armies and that the Panzer Division should be preserved for the conquest of France. Furthermore, some believe Hitler feared a major French counterattack from the south and decided not to waste his armoured strength on finishing off a weakened enemy. Whatever the reason, the miracle of Dunkirk did occur. And a third component of this miracle was the unseasonably bad weather that settled over the region for several days, which significantly hampered the operations of the German Air Force and provided a crucial respite for the men and ships involved in the rescue of the Allied army. Winston Churchill had initially hoped that, under the most favourable circumstances, only 40 to 45,000 soldiers could be brought back to Britain. Therefore, when he spoke in the House of Commons on June 4th, he called what had happened at Dunkirk a miracle of deliverance. At the same time, he urged a sober perspective. The British Prime Minister famously declared, "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." However, after the war, German generals could not fully agree with Churchill's assessment. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, whose plan had enabled the occupation of France in a matter of weeks, wrote in his memoirs, "We were misled by the sight of the military equipment left behind by the enemy in enormous quantities on the coast of Dunkirk, and we did not yet know that the British had, in essence, completely saved their army."